A colony that looks full of bees in November can be dead by March, not because winter killed it, but because autumn never ended inside the hive. That is the quiet paradox that catches experienced beekeepers off guard far more often than beginners. The brood nest is still active, the queen is still laying, the population looks dense on the frames, and yet something is already wrong, something that will not become visible for another 4 months. Have you experienced this in your own hives? A colony that looked strong going into winter only to dwindle and collapse before the first dandelion bloom? If this scenario sounds familiar, hit the like button, because the biology behind it deserves a closer look. The practice in question involves feeding heavy syrup, typically a 2-to-1 sugar-to-water ratio, deep into the fall season, well past the point where natural nectar flows have ended. The intention is sound on the surface. Beekeepers see light hives, worry about starvation, and reach for the feeder. But the timing of that feeding decision carries consequences that extend far beyond the sugar itself. And to understand why, it is necessary to look at what is actually happening inside the colony as autumn progresses, not in terms of human calendars, but in terms of bee biology. In a normally cycling colony, as day length shortens and nectar sources dry up in late summer and early fall, the queen's laying rate declines. This is not a failure. This is not a sign of a weak queen. This is one of the most important biological transitions of the entire year. The reduction in brood rearing is the signal, both chemical and nutritional, that shifts the colony from producing short-lived summer foragers to producing long-lived winter bees. These winter bees are physiologically distinct. They carry elevated levels of a protein called vitellogenin, stored primarily in their fat bodies. Vitellogenin serves multiple roles. It functions as a nutrient reserve, supports immune response, and contributes to the production of brood food later in the season when the colony restarts in spring. A winter bee with fully developed fat bodies and high vitellogenin stores can live 4 to 6 months. A summer forager, by comparison, lives roughly 5 to 6 weeks. The difference is not just lifespan. It is the capacity to sustain the colony through the entire non-foraging season and still have enough physiological reserve to raise the first generation of spring brood. Here is where the fall syrup problem begins. When a beekeeper introduces heavy syrup in late October or November, particularly in northern climates where natural pollen and nectar have been absent for weeks, the colony receives an artificial nectar signal. The sugar solution mimics incoming resources. The queen responds. She begins laying again, or she continues laying at a rate she would have otherwise reduced. Nurse bees begin consuming their own protein reserves, including vitellogenin, to produce royal jelly for the new brood. What most beekeepers misunderstand is this. The syrup provides carbohydrates, but it provides no protein. The colony is being told that resources are flowing in, but the actual nutritional foundation for brood rearing is being drawn entirely from the bodies of the bees themselves. The bees that should be conserving their fat body reserves for a 5-month winter are instead metabolizing those reserves to feed larvae that may never contribute meaningfully to spring survival. More bees. Less resilience. This is the visual contradiction that defines the problem. A beekeeper opens a hive in late November and sees capped brood. I sees bees covering 8 or 9 frames, sees stored syrup in the combs. Everything looks strong, but the bees on those frames are physiologically compromised. Their fat bodies are partially depleted. Their vitellogenin levels are lower than they should be. They have aged themselves by weeks in the process of raising brood that the colony did not need, brood that was stimulated not by the environment, but by a feeder. The consequences do not appear immediately. They appear in January. They appear in February. The cluster begins to shrink faster than it should. Bees that should have had another 2 months of life are dying on the bottom board in week 12 instead of week 20. The colony is consuming stores at a higher rate because its thermoregulation is less efficient with a smaller cluster. And by the time the first pollen sources appear in late winter or early spring, the colony does not have enough healthy nurse bees to capitalize on the moment. Spring buildup stalls. And the colony that looked strong in November is now struggling to cover 4 frames. But the brood extension problem does not stop at nutrition. There is a second compounding factor, and this one involves Varroa destructor. If you value biology-based beekeeping, consider subscribing. Varroa mites reproduce exclusively inside capped brood cells. A female mite enters a cell shortly before it is capped, and over the roughly 12 days of worker brood development, longer in drone brood, she produces offspring. When the adult bee emerges, the mature mite daughters emerge with it, ready to infest new cells. In a colony that is naturally reducing brood in the fall, this reproduction cycle slows dramatically. Fewer brood cells mean fewer opportunities for mites to reproduce. A natural brood break, even a partial one, is one of the most effective passive mite management events of the year. Late-season syrup feeding disrupts this. By extending brood rearing into November or even December, the colony is providing Varroa with additional reproductive cycles at precisely the time when mite pressure should be declining. Each additional cycle can increase the mite population meaningfully, not in a dramatic, visible way, but incrementally. A colony that entered October with a manageable mite load can enter December with a load that crosses a critical threshold, particularly if the beekeeper treated for mites in August or September and assumed the problem was resolved. This is a narrow decision window that many beekeepers miss entirely. The mite treatment was effective. The count dropped. But then the syrup went on, brood continued, and the residual mite population, the survivors of treatment, had fresh brood to reproduce in for another 6 to 8 weeks. By midwinter, the mites that were feeding on those winter bees are transmitting viruses, particularly deformed wing virus, to the very bees the colony depends on for spring survival. The damage is not visible on the outside of the hive. It is happening at the cellular level, inside the fat bodies and hemolymph of bees that appear normal but are immunologically weakened. Now, the question that follows logically is this. If fall feeding can cause these problems, when should colonies be fed, and how should weight be assessed? The answer depends on geography, but the principle is consistent. The goal of fall feeding is to ensure adequate stored carbohydrates before the colony transitions to its winter cluster configuration. In most northern temperate climates, this means feeding should be completed by mid to late September, no later than early October. The target hive weight varies by region and hive style, but a general guideline for a standard 10-frame Langstroth colony going into winter in the northern United States or southern Canada is a total hive weight of roughly 85 to 95 pounds, depending on local winter length. This includes bees, woodenware, and stored honey or syrup. The critical detail is this. The feeding should be done early enough that the colony has time to process the syrup, cap it, and then reduce brood rearing naturally before cold weather sets in. Feeding 2-to-1 syrup in September gives the bees time to dehydrate it and store it properly. Feeding the same syrup in November does not just add food, it reactivates biological processes that should already be winding down. Temperature matters as well. Bees have difficulty processing heavy syrup when ambient temperatures drop below about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Feeding below this threshold means the syrup may sit in the feeder unconsumed, or it may be taken down but not properly cured, leading to fermentation in the comb, which creates its own set of problems in midwinter. The window for effective fall feeding is, in most regions, narrower than beekeepers assume. It is not a late-season safety net. It is a mid-autumn preparation step. What about colonies that are genuinely underweight in late October? This is where the decision becomes more difficult, and where the biology must guide the response. An underweight colony in late October is already at risk. Adding syrup at that point may keep it from starving, but it will also extend brood and compromise winter bee quality. In some cases, the more effective approach is to consolidate, combining a weak, underweight colony with a stronger one rather than trying to rescue it with late feeding. A combined colony with adequate stores and a full complement of healthy winter bees has a better chance of spring survival than two separate colonies, and one of which was fed too late and is now running on compromised workers. For beekeepers who choose to provide late emergency feeding, the method matters. Fondant or dry sugar, placed directly above the cluster, provides carbohydrates without the moisture and nectar-mimicking properties of liquid syrup. Dry sugar does not stimulate brood rearing in the same way that liquid syrup does. It is consumed more slowly, does not require the same degree of processing, and does not trigger the same physiological response in the queen. It is not a perfect solution, no emergency intervention in beekeeping ever is, but it avoids the specific cascade of problems created by liquid syrup feeding in late autumn. Strong colony, weak surplus. That is the paradox of overstimulation. The colony invested its reserves in brood instead of in self-preservation. The historical record supports this understanding, though not always in the language modern beekeepers use. European beekeeping manuals from the late 19th and early 20th centuries frequently emphasized the importance of having colonies settled before the onset of cold weather. The language varied. Some referred to colonies being quiet or prepared. But the underlying observation was consistent. Colonies that were still actively rearing brood when the first hard frosts arrived fared worse over winter than those that had ceased brood rearing earlier. Beekeepers in that era did not have the vocabulary of vitellogenin or fat body protein reserves, but they had generations of observational data that pointed to the same conclusion. Late activity weakens winter survival. In parts of Central Europe, where fall feeding with sugar syrup became widespread in the 20th century, partly as a response to honey harvesting that left colonies short on stores, the timing of feeding was treated with considerable precision. German and Austrian beekeeping texts from the 1920s and 1930s recommended completing all feeding by the end of September in most regions, with specific adjustments for altitude and latitude. The reasoning was practical. Colonies fed later entered winter in poorer condition. The biology behind this observation would not be fully described for another 70 years, but the empirical pattern was clear. There is one more timing risk worth noting. In regions experiencing warmer autumns, whether due to annual variation or longer-term climate trends, the natural brood reduction may already be delayed. Colonies in these areas may still have active brood nests in October, even without supplemental feeding. Adding syrup on top of an already extended natural brood cycle compounds the problem. The beekeeper is not just replacing a missing signal. They are amplifying one that is already too strong. In these situations, monitoring hive weight and brood status in mid-September becomes especially important. The decision to feed or not to feed should be based on stored weight and brood pattern, not on the calendar date alone. The core mechanism at the center of all of this is singular and consistent. Late-season brood extension depletes the nutrient reserves of winter bees and sustains mite reproduction during a period when both should be declining. Everything else, the feeding method, the timing, the hive weight target, the regional variation, flows from that single biological reality. Beekeepers who understand this mechanism do not necessarily change what they feed. They change when they feed. They change how they assess colony readiness. They stop interpreting a late fall brood nest as a sign of strength and start recognizing it for what it may actually be, a signal that the colony's winter preparation has been disrupted. The adjustment is not dramatic. It is a shift in timing, a shift in observation, and a recognition that the biological calendar of the colony does not always align with the beekeeper's management calendar. The bees have not changed. Their physiology follows the same patterns it has followed for thousands of years. The variable is the input and the timing of that input that the beekeeper introduces. Getting that timing right does not guarantee spring survival, but getting it wrong, feeding heavy syrup deep into autumn, extending brood past its natural decline, and giving Varroa additional reproductive cycles, is one of the most reliable ways to weaken a colony that otherwise had every chance of making it through to spring. If this breakdown was useful, leave a comment with your experience. Subscribe for more historically grounded beekeeping insights.